everyone, Camilla here from Decodable Readers Australia. Today we're going to have a look at the topic of blends. Now I'm going to actually start this video with a very bold statement that might challenge the thinking of many educators. Blends is a verb, not a noun. What I mean by that is blends is something that a student should do to letter sounds to be able to decode the words. So they blend those sounds together to read a word. Now in traditional thinking, blends was actually a noun. It was a sound unit made by two consonants. For example, the traditional thinking of blends comes in words like this. We have the word frog, the f and the together are coming together to make fr, almost like a co-articulation of one sound unit. That is traditional thinking. Same here, the word black has b and l together to make bull. And so that is what traditional thinking of blends is. But today I am actually going to address 4 very common concerns that if you add blends into your program, how it can actually have a detrimental effect to student learning, especially your most vulnerable learners. And then at the end, I'm actually going to show you how you can incorporate effective methodologies in your classroom to ensure that students are still able to read and spell these types of words without adding blends. Now, before we get started, let's give you a new term for the traditional noun of blends. It's called consonant clusters. And yes, we can still teach that when two consonants are close together, we can hear that blending process, but they are not one sound unit. So let's jump in and have a look at the problems with traditional blends as a noun. Problem number 1 is cognitive overload, especially for your most vulnerable students. Now, the English language has 44 speech sounds. That's complex in itself. If we start adding more sound units to that, it can really get overwhelming for a learner. So in traditional blends where 2 letters come together to make one sound unit, we actually have loads more sounds. If we really dig down deep, there are actually over 28 beginning blends and over 48 blends that happen at the end of a word. So you can see once we have our 44 speech sounds, our 28 beginning blends, our 48 end blends, this would be absolutely cognitive overload for our vulnerable learners. In fact, not even our vulnerable learners, but all learners. We need to make sure that we are keeping true to that sound to print. We've got 44 speech sounds. Let's represent those sounds with their graphemes and teach to blend those together, because then the traditional blends, which we're now calling consonant clusters, we will be able to blend those consonant clusters together to read words. So there's no actual point in teaching all of these extra sound units. Problem number 2, it would slow down your scope and sequence. If you actually had to add the traditional blends as individual sound units, what actually happens is that that extra 28 blends as beginning blends, the 48 blends as the end blends would actually need to be incorporated into your scope and sequence. And what would actually happen is a delay in the teaching of the 44 English speech sounds, because you've added just so much more. So what students actually need are a scope and sequence with the 44 speech sounds and be taught how to blend any of those sounds together, not just those consonant clusters as we traditionally believed as blends. Problem number 3. Teachers adding unlearned sounds. Now, this is a personal experience of mine. When being in a classroom, I have seen teachers teach blends, and because they're teaching that particular blend, they've had to add other sounds that haven't been explicitly taught to be able to teach the blend. For example, let's have a look at the traditional thinking around the full. And the students start brainstorming all the words with full. So there's flag and flee and fly and flap. And although orally we can say them, if we want to get down to the true decoding of these, we need to have a look at all the sounds and the letter combinations that make those sounds in order to know whether we're going to be able to read these words. We might be able to read this part, but we need to be able to read the whole word. And if the parts of the word that follow this blend have not been taught, then this would actually not be an effective lesson. So for example, we have the word flee here. You would need to make sure that that had been explicitly taught and practiced before a student would be able to read this. And usually when introducing blends like this, we do it very early in the scope and sequence, so these types of sounds would not have been explicitly taught. So unfortunately, blends brings other sounds to the table, and we know that students need to read controlled texts that have letter sound correspondences that they have been explicitly taught. So unfortunately, the traditional method of teaching blends brings in unlearnt sounds and can set some students up for failure because they are unable to read the whole word, because it's not just about the beginning, it's about reading from left to right and blending those sounds together. Problem number 4, teaching blends can sometimes have a negative effect on spelling. Now, depending on how blends are taught or consonant clusters, it can transfer to their spelling, sometimes in a negative way. When students are taught that two letters come together to make one sound, but it actually represents two sounds, so I'm not talking about digraphs, which we'll talk about next week, but when we talk about blends, two letters coming together to make one sound unit, what tends to happen in their writing or their spelling is they'll leave an actual letter out, thinking it would represent that sound unit. You often see students write the word went, W-E-T, and that's because they're not being explicitly taught to hear every sound as an individual sound. W-E-N-T. So we need to make sure that we explicitly teach each sound unit individually rather than bringing two sounds together to make one sound unit. So let's review those problems. Number 1, cognitive overload by adding all those extra sound units. Number 2, slowing down the scope and sequence. Number 3, teachers adding unlearnt sounds. And number 4, a negative effect on spelling. So now that you can see that blends can actually be a problem or detrimental to the learning, especially your vulnerable learners, let's jump across to an effective method of teaching blending. Blending as a verb rather than as a noun. I'm going to take you across to our blending board. These blending boards are in our SOR toolkit. That's our Sounds of Reading toolkit. So let's jump across and have a look at how we would teach blends as a verb. When we understand that words are made up of sounds, and those sounds are our 44 English speech sounds, we can start the blending and segmenting process. So how do we do it? Let's have a look at the word flap. What we get the students to do is say the word flap. Now say it very slowly and bring down a sound counter for each sound in the word, like this. F-L-A-P. So we can see that there are 4 individual sounds. Our full does not come together at this stage. We have F-L-A-P. Then from there, we represent those sounds with our letters. So our F is represented by the letter F. L, we go to our letter L. Then we have our A, and then we have our P. And what we can do from there is then blend those sounds together to read the words. Flap, flap. Now, when we look at words like this, we can then have that individual sound manipulation. We can change flap to slap. We change our f to s. Now, if this is taught as a blend, we would not be able to do this. We'd have to change both of those sounds out for an individual sound unit, which adds that extra complexity that is not needed. This type of word work in a daily setting is so important to teach students how to blend those sounds together to read all words. We don't need to focus on just consonant clusters at the start. We actually need to teach them to blend their way right through the whole word, and with letter sound correspondences that they have been explicitly taught. So let's start changing our thinking. Blending is a verb and not a noun. Consonant clusters are important and learning to blend them together is important, but it's just as important to learn to blend all of your consonant and vowels together to read words. So now you have it. Blends is a verb, not a noun.